This man standing before you decided to use his talents to entertain people with spectacular performances. But unlike him, there were thousands of others with even greater skills who chose not to perform. Instead, they became thieves. In 1975, there was one man with incredible abilities, lightning-fast reflexes that enabled him to pull off such feats, perhaps even faster. He would board a train or a bus, and by the time he got off, he had already picked the pockets of half the passengers with such ease and cunning. The result was always the same: wallets, cash, watches, all stolen daily. But one day, he decided to stop stealing, to dedicate himself to a cause he believed to be more sacred. His new mission was to cleanse Europe of all immigrants. This decision earned him the infamous title of the Laser Killer, a literal nightmare for any immigrant in Europe. For those following me for the first time, I am Amin the narrator, and I talk about everything strange and mysterious on planet Earth. Today, I will tell you the story of John Ausinos, known as the unluckiest killer in the world, the man who planned to purify Europe of all immigrants. Everything he did was backed by a party and a movement, but despite his notoriety, he ultimately failed. The story you're about to hear is unlike any other. On an ordinary day in 1975, John boarded a local bus, just as he always did, and moved among the passengers. John carefully chose the timing of his bus rides, either at 7 a.m. when people were heading to work, 2 p.m. during the lunch break, or 7 p.m. when they returned home. His favorite time was 7 a.m. when people were still half asleep, making them easy targets. He had an uncanny ability to read people and pick his targets. He'd approach someone, strike up a conversation, or joke with them, pretending they were old friends. During that brief moment of distraction, he'd do what you saw at the beginning of this story: slip his hand into their pocket, taking wallets, cash, papers, anything of value. He never left a target without taking something, and when he saw an elderly person, he'd offer his hand to help them off the bus, all the while relieving them of their watch. The old man would thank him, thinking John was a gentleman, never realizing that his watch was already gone. John believed that elderly people often wore expensive watches, either because they were antiques or the only valuable possession they owned. That's why he never spared them. He stole from every senior he could find. After leaving the bus with a watch or other valuable item, John would head to the market to get it appraised, offering it to multiple shops. Once he knew its value, he would take it to a pawn shop, a place that lent money against valuable items in exchange for collateral. For example, if the watch was worth $100, he'd pawn it and receive a loan of the same amount for a set period. If he repaid the loan, he'd get the watch back. Otherwise, the pawn shop would have the right to sell the item. John used this method to avoid direct sales of stolen goods, ensuring that no one could trace the items back to him. He calculated everything with remarkable precision, always acting with cunning intelligence, until greed led him to explore a new path in an entirely different field. It's essential to note that all these events took place in Sweden, Stockholm, yet John wasn't Swedish. He was a Swiss immigrant. He was born in Lidingö, Sweden, on July 12, 1953. His father was Swiss, and his mother was German, immigrants who had settled in Sweden. His appearance never fit in with the typical Swedish look. He had dark hair, an olive complexion, and brown eyes, quite different from the blonde hair and blue eyes of the locals. Throughout his childhood, he endured endless insults and bullying. His classmates didn't even bother to learn his real name. They called him Turoki. Turoki meant a non-European who spoke their language. But when they really wanted to insult him, they called him Latte, implying he was white, but from the Middle East. At that time, being called Latte was a severe insult in Scandinavia. John's childhood was marked by pain and bitterness because of this treatment. By the age of 8, he had already tried to end his life 3 times, and by 14, he was dyeing his hair blonde and wearing blue contact lenses. Imagine how much this affected him, driving him to such lengths. Yet, despite his disguise, his German accent always gave him away. This only made things worse. Germans were deeply resented in Europe during that era, still blamed for the horrors of World War II. John's only escape was to continue his education at a German boarding school. At first, it seemed like a great solution, and he was finally free from the bullying. But unfortunately, things turned out to be even worse there. The students at the school had all suffered in similar ways, and they formed a small Nazi gang, with dreams as twisted as Hitler's. We won't delve too deeply into this part of the story, but let's just say they met every evening, discussing Nazi ideology from their favorite books. The group grew in size and influence, led by a charismatic figure who fiercely promoted their ideals. But unbeknownst to them, the leader was a government informant. His real mission was to infiltrate this group of young men and report their activities back to the Swedish authorities. This undercover operation led to the group's downfall, and all the students were sent to a juvenile reformatory, where they stayed for 2 years. When John finally got out in 1971, he had used his time in the reformatory to hone his skills in pickpocketing and sleight of hand, stealing whatever he could from guards and fellow inmates. For John, this was all just training. So, when he was released, he was more than ready to resume his life of crime, immediately returning to theft, while still collecting unemployment benefits from the Swedish government. As we mentioned earlier, John continued his criminal career until 1975, escalating his activities to much higher stakes, robbing private banks. His methods were straightforward and cunning. He would study the bank, watching those making transactions, and noting exactly where they stored their cash. When the customer left the bank, John would approach them, asking for directions or engaging them in small talk, all while relieving them of their valuables. He repeated this routine over and over until it became too easy and monotonous. He thought, why not go inside the bank itself and take what he wanted directly? With his non-Swedish appearance, he adopted a manner of speech that was meant to intimidate the bank employees, making them believe he was part of the Italian mafia. He calmly demanded the cash from the vault, pulling off one of his most daring heists with nothing more than a comb disguised as a weapon. He would hide the comb in his pocket, pretending it was a gun, and threaten the teller with it. If they didn't cooperate, he'd make it seem like he was ready to pull the trigger. This clever ruse allowed him to get away with just enough to avoid harsh sentences if caught, minimizing his risk while maximizing his loot. He always had a stash of cash set aside, ready to pay his bail the moment he got arrested, confident he could walk free in no time. Surprisingly, he managed to rob 19 banks without getting caught, staying one step ahead of the authorities at every turn. But on his 20th heist, in 1981, everything fell apart. He broke his own rule by targeting a large bank, and this time, his luck ran out. The larger banks had much tighter security, with clear serial numbers on all the cash and the police already close by, waiting for any sign of trouble. He knew if he used that money, he'd be tracked down instantly. Yet, in a moment of greed, he went after the big score, and it cost him dearly. The authorities were ready, and the moment he set foot in that bank, they closed in on him, arresting him on the spot. John realized his mistake. He'd always targeted mid-sized banks before, never the big ones, and now he was paying the price. In small banks, any loss could bankrupt the institution, so security was much tighter. John preferred to avoid those, but on that fateful day, he ignored his instincts. He thought he could handle the big leagues, but he was wrong. As soon as he was behind bars, he realized there was no quick way out this time. While in prison, he met Miro Parčić, a Croatian tied to the neo-fascist movement, a man whose ideas would change John's life forever. Miro had been imprisoned for assassinating the Yugoslavian ambassador to Sweden. Fate brought John and Miro together, and they became close friends. Over the next 2 years, Miro indoctrinated John into fascist ideology, converting him fully to their cause. By the time he left prison, John had joined the Ustaš, a Croatian fascist movement with a vision to reshape Europe's future. He abandoned the pain of his past and embraced a new mission: to rid Europe of immigrants, driven by a twisted sense of purpose. Once released, John went to Croatia, where he swore an oath before the movement's leaders to wipe out European culture as they knew it. Suddenly, John was no longer just a thief. He was a man with a cause. But the choices he made after that would be anything but predictable. Returning to Sweden, John used funds from the movement to invest in the stock market and build a fortune, amassing wealth and status in a very short time. He soon became a millionaire, with several cars and properties in Stockholm, living a life far from the hardships he once knew. For 3 years, from 1983, he gambled away his fortune in casinos and squandered his money on vices, losing everything he had built. The movement continued to support him financially, and he even gained Swedish citizenship, positioning himself as a key player in their political ambitions. His goal was to enter parliament and secure a government post, paving the way for the movement to take control of the country. But when he lost all his money, he had no choice but to disappear and return to his old ways, planning new bank heists with renewed desperation. This time, he took a different approach, volunteering for the military, convincing the movement he was infiltrating from within. He told them it was all part of his master plan, that joining the army was far more strategic than any civilian position. The fascist movement believed his words and supported him once again. During this time, he focused heavily on learning how to make weapons, assemble them, and use them effectively. He wanted to be prepared for the future plan he had devised. In 1987, after 2 years in the military, he suggested to the movement that he should be discharged. He told them it was necessary to get back into the streets and work among the people because he was facing racism. The Swedes would never give him a position in the military. He always felt like an outsider, like an immigrant among them. The movement agreed with him and discharged him. From that moment, his life took a turn for the worse. Once discharged, John bought a pistol and a small submachine gun. He even crafted his own suppressor for them, so no one would hear the shots when he fired. But his craftsmanship was terrible. The high pressure and heat from the bullets caused the suppressor he made to melt. Whenever he fired the gun, the bullets would veer off course because the suppressor bent or warped. Yet he had no choice but to keep using those weapons. Why? Because this time, the movement was watching him. So, he decided to fix the suppressor and replace it with a laser sight instead. He claimed that with the laser, he would aim 100% accurately. And so, he set out for his first mission. He went to a coastal city called Hertzborg, where illegal immigrants would arrive by sea from Denmark. To make a long story short, over the course of 2 years, he managed to shoot only 5 immigrants. Why? Because he couldn't aim properly. When he fired at someone, the bullet would land somewhere else. Even the 5 he hit all survived. Out of 153 attacks over 2 years, not a single person died. When the immigrants' boats appeared, he would aim the laser at them, then fire. Although he didn't hurt anyone, the red laser became a topic of fear among people. People began to scare each other with stories of the red laser. Anywhere that light appeared meant the killer was near, and gunshots would soon follow. Many criminals started using this tactic to frighten people. As for John, after 2 years of attempts, instead of changing his weapon, he retreated to the forest between Finland and Sweden, where he stayed for a whole year. He carried out more than 80 attacks, injuring only 4 migrants. But this time, all 4 died. During this period, the police were searching for him, but they couldn't catch him. His simple lifestyle and routine in that area didn't make him appear suspicious. He seemed like a kind, modest man, always sitting outside his home reading books. It was impossible to believe he could be the laser killer the police were looking for. At the same time, you should know that the Swedish police didn't take the matter too seriously for two reasons. First, the victims were immigrants, so in a way, he was doing them a favor. Second, in 3 years, he only shot 9 people. 5 survived, and 4 died. In their view, this didn't justify a large-scale investigation. Besides, the killer had suddenly disappeared. No one knew that John had gone back to the movement's headquarters and asked for another chance to rebuild his fortune. He told them this time he didn't need any financial support. He just wanted their permission to do what he intended. And this time, the movement agreed for 2 reasons. First, they were suffering from financial problems and were close to disbanding. Second, John was a skilled man who could be relied on for such tasks. So they told him to continue and do whatever he saw fit. John returned to the capital, Stockholm, and resumed stealing. From public buses, people walking in the streets, and more. He targeted people leaving banks, those withdrawing money from ATMs, and even cashiers in lightly guarded banks. He would do anything that brought him money. After accumulating some money, he returned to the stock market, made a fortune, but soon fell into bankruptcy again. That's when the fascist movement shut down their office, and John was left free. But he wanted to continue what he had started. One evening in 1991, a 21-year-old Eritrean immigrant named David was walking down the street with his girlfriend. Suddenly, his girlfriend told him that there was a red laser on his back. Before she could finish speaking, David was shot near his spine. Fortunately, he didn't die, but the threat of the laser killer returned, this time in the heart of the capital. The crucial detail was that John had upgraded to modern weapons and had 100% accuracy. 3 months later, he shot another man, an Iranian immigrant named Sharon, aged 25. Strangely, John shot him inside Stockholm University. This caused a huge uproar. Sharon spent 3 months in intensive care but survived. This only made John more ruthless. He began shooting any immigrant he saw. The exact number of people John killed is still unknown, but it's believed to be a massive number. Only 3 of his victims survived and could provide testimony. John reached a point where he was shooting people at close range. To this day, it's said that he killed many more people than we know about. Despite numerous deals offered by investigators, he refused to confess. The end of his story came when he entered a restaurant frequented by Iranian immigrants to scout for his next target. He noticed a young man sitting alone. The man was a Brazilian immigrant waiting for his Iranian friend. John approached him and, right there in the restaurant, shot him 3 times. One of the bullets fractured his skull but didn't penetrate his brain. The man survived and was able to give a detailed description of John because they had been sitting face to face for a full 15 minutes before the attack. Based on this description, the police started searching for John. Strangely, John returned to the same restaurant looking for another victim. He waited outside the restaurant until someone came out. When a man finally did, John followed him and shot him. The victim's name was Jimmy. Jimmy was an Iranian immigrant who had gained Swedish citizenship. He didn't die immediately, but was able to give the police a detailed description of John before passing away. This made it much easier for the police to track John down. Before shooting Jimmy, John had walked right past him and even said, "Good evening." To this day, John claims he doesn't know why he greeted Jimmy before killing him. After Jimmy's death, John decided to take a trip to Las Vegas. He spent 2 months in the U.S., 2 weeks of which were in Las Vegas, and the rest of the time in the Nevada desert, at a shooting range. During this period, he made 3 arms deals, acquiring powerful, custom-made weapons. His condition was that these weapons be delivered to Stockholm. Before returning to Sweden, he trained extensively with the new weapons, and made sure he was capable of using them with precision. He realized that the laser sight had become outdated. Around that time, a crime occurred in Stockholm that shocked all of Sweden: the assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme. The killer used a rifle with a red laser sight. Naturally, the media immediately linked the assassination to the laser killer. They speculated that Olof Palme's immigration policies, which had increased the flow of migrants to Sweden by 800%, made him a target. It seemed obvious to the public that the person who killed Palme was the same one responsible for the migrant killings, the laser killer. The strange thing was that at the time of Palme's assassination, John wasn't even in Stockholm. However, he soon returned to collect his weapons from Nevada. After receiving the weapons, he shot 5 more migrants. None of them died. The last victim was a young Palestinian named Hossam Zatara. Hossam managed to give a very accurate description of John. He told investigators that John was likely German because of his accent when they briefly spoke before the shooting. Hossam recognized that John's accent wasn't Swedish, but sounded closer to German. After this, the police intensified their search with the help of European investigators. The assassination of the Prime Minister was too significant for the authorities to ignore. It was critical that they catch the laser killer. Despite a large-scale investigation, John remained elusive. No one could find him, and everyone wondered how he would eventually be caught. Let me tell you, it happened entirely by chance. John had a financial obligation and needed money. He thought, why not rob a bank? His plan was to rob a mid-sized bank, thinking that its security wouldn't be too tight. After all, times had changed since his last heist. The robbery took place on May 30th, 1992, the same day and month I was born, though I won't tell you the year. John hadn't robbed a bank in 10 years and didn't realize how advanced security had become. He was spotted outside the bank, and his plan failed. The police arrived quickly, and he was arrested like an ordinary thief. But his behavior during the arrest was anything but normal. John broke down inside the police car, and when they took him to the station, he attacked his lawyer. His actions were so erratic that they raised suspicion. As he was beating the lawyer, he yelled something that caught the investigators' attention. "It's bigger than just a robbery." This led to a search warrant for his home, and there, they uncovered shocking evidence. His house was covered in pictures of Mussolini and Hitler. His communications with the fascist movement were all recorded, and he had written detailed accounts of his activities in his journals. He had a library of 350 books, all about fascist ideology. Statues and other artifacts reflected his obsession with the cause. But the most disturbing discovery was his detailed record of every crime he had committed. Contrary to what was believed, he hadn't shot just 20 or 25 people. John had fired on over 2,000 individuals. In each case, he documented how he shot them and what happened to them. After a lengthy investigation that lasted 4 months, it was confirmed that John was the laser killer. However, he was cleared of any involvement in the Prime Minister's assassination. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. It was also revealed that John suffered from mental illness, schizophrenia, and a form of autism. His fame only complicated matters further. A 23-year-old woman had been writing to him and had a 3-month romantic relationship with him. When she finally visited him in 2006, she discovered that he was much older and worn out. The realization of his age and deteriorating health led him to multiple suicide attempts. Imagine, he even paid prison guards over $10,000 to help him end his life. But to this day, his plans have failed. John Ausinos remains alive, imprisoned in the capital of Sweden, Stockholm. He is now 71 years old. That was our story for today. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, please like the video. Let's see the number of likes on this video. In case you are interested in these kind of stories, Tell me on the comment section. Is John a racism victim? Or you are who you hang out with? I'm Amin the narrator. See you in another video.